tips for dealing with the bank. So perhaps you're renting in a property where it is run by a body corporate.
Understanding the basic calculation, income minus expenses, and you want to be left with a positive income.
It is a very tough game. It's not easy at all.
To stay ahead of knowing exactly what your clients need, what their teething issues are.
Have a joint move-in inspection.
That a lot of people that are coming into sectional title homeowners associations are just like you described, not only first-time homeowners, but first-time owners and residents in community schemes.
They get to see the perspective from the other side of the aisle. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
It's a market that's estimated to be transacting at least 9 billion rand per year. So it's a huge market.
In order to get there, you need to be able to build up a track record.
Your cash flow model needs to be sharp.
A quote comes to mind. The best time to buy a property was about 10 years ago. The next best time is now.
Good evening and welcome to episode 85 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama Khumalo. It's the Wednesday edition of the Private Property Podcast, and as usual, we're speaking to ABSA. And this evening, we're going to be exploring something that I'm sure a few people have either wanted to get into or certainly have already gotten themselves into. That is, of course, buying a joint property. So if you've ever wanted to buy a property with perhaps your spouse or even friends or family, this is certainly the episode you do not want to miss. There are so many terms and conditions that you want to always be mindful of when you're buying into a joint, when you're buying a joint property. And I think one of the things, of course, is how it perhaps even affects your own finances, what the requirements are, how many people can even, sign up for that particular property. These are some of the things that we'll be exploring this evening right here on the Private Property Podcast. And to help us better understand what these T's and C's are when it comes into buying a joint property, I'm joined this evening by Kamini, Ramsamy, who is the head of acquisitions and pricing at ABSA Home Loans. Good evening, Kamini. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Zama, and thank you for having me.
I think one of the big things that we want to, probably go into when we talk about buying a joint property that a lot of people will probably have question marks about are some of the financial terms and considerations when it comes to joint bond lending. Perhaps take us through what the bank is essentially looking for when you are buying a property as two or even more individuals.
Okay, Zama, so look, when it comes to mortgage lending, there are two types of mortgage lending. There's obviously your consumer lending under the consumer's name, or there's commercial lending under the legal entity. So for this evening, I'm going to focus on consumer lending. Under consumer lending, joint consumers are co-principal debtors who are jointly and severally liable for the mortgage loan agreement. So these individuals apply jointly for the loan agreement, and this excludes the surety under a credit guarantee. So essentially, you have joint individuals who apply for properties to live in, or joint individuals who apply for properties to let out. If you are married in community of property, this application is seen as a joint application by the bank.
And we've actually, spoken to an attorney a few weeks ago around, buying property when you're married in community of property. If you did miss that episode, do go through to our past episodes right here on YouTube or Facebook to have a look at that particular. And there's certainly various terms and conditions when you're married in community of property that you always want to be mindful of, especially when it comes to buying property. Now, Kamini, what is the maximum number of people who can essentially, get into a joint bond? Because I can imagine, it's certainly simple when you're just thinking, my spouse and I are going to buy a property. We're certainly seeing a rise of people wanting to buy properties as friends. Perhaps, when the bank isn't looking at an application, is there a maximum number of people who can go into a joint application? And what is it?
Okay, so there is no maximum number of participants. What you typically find is the application form may limit you to a maximum number of participants that you can submit. But this does not mean that this is the maximum number of participants that is allowed in the application. One may submit a separate application for the participants that the application form does not allow by the maximum allowable. What you typically find that the popular number for joint home loans in South Africa is 2 individuals. We do get applications where there are 3 individuals under consumer lending, but thereafter the volumes are far and wide and more focused on the commercial side.
And I guess, we were touching a bit earlier on around people who are married in community of property and how that's viewed automatically as, as a joint bond, essentially. Perhaps take us through, what people need to be mindful of when they are married. And let's suppose it's you're either married in community of property or you're not married in community of property. So if you're married in community of property and you want to go into a joint bond, suppose with somebody else, what kind of considerations needs to go into that? Does that mean that your spouse kind of automatically also is a signatory? What are some of the terms and conditions in that regard?
Yes, so remember, when you are married in community of property, there's just one estate. So like I explained, it is a joint application in that case, but you don't have to be married to apply for a joint bond. You can be a single couple that's living together. You can be a group of friends applying for a joint bond. So when it comes to marriage, though, specifically, so you've got community of property, you've got your ANC with or without accrual. If you're applying for a joint bond and you're married with ANC, irrespective of whether it's with or without accrual, there's just one estate there. So there we would assess the borrower, unless the borrower depends on the spouse from an affordability perspective. If it's a joint bond, both parties have to sign. Remember, both parties are liable for the full loan agreement.
And you've actually mentioned something that I know people sometimes probably don't think about, and that's the issue of affordability and how a joint bond potentially affects one's affordability. Perhaps take us through how that happens, because I think I've certainly heard of instances where perhaps a sibling wants to buy their first property and they've started working, so they don't quite afford the house they're looking at. Then they're not even necessarily looking at an expensive house, but they certainly can't fully afford the particular house that they're looking at, so they turn to an older sibling to get into a joint bond so that they're able to afford it. How does getting into then a joint bond actually affect the two separate people's affordability, especially for future property transactions? Because I can imagine certainly a lot of viewers of the Private Property Podcast have an interest in property and also want to buy more than one property. So we're looking at beyond buying your primary residence. How does getting into a joint bond essentially affect our affordability from a holistic perspective?
Yeah, so remember, when you are getting into a joint bond, first and foremost, you want to know who you're getting into the joint bond with. So my advice, if you are getting into a joint bond, first and foremost, you need to sit down, go through a breakdown of your income expenses, know your affordability, because once you become a homeowner, you may need to make sacrifices. So you may need to not have takeout every week. You may need to not do so much of online shopping every month, and these are the kind of sacrifices that one may need to make if they want to be a homeowner. Secondly, you want to be proactive. So my advice is to then to do a credit check, for you and the partner, or for you and the joint participants. You want to know beforehand if your partners have got a history of debt on the credit bureau. Then you also want to know if you pre-qualify for the loan. At Absa, we do offer pre-qualified products. So we've got something called the Home Loan Estimator on our homeowners app, where it takes you through minimal steps of the application. and informs you if you pre-qualify for the application or not. If you are married, there is some legal protection that applies to joint bonds. But if you are single, you may want to look at protecting yourself by, contacting your attorney, drawing up a domestic partnership agreement. Now, a DPA is something that sort of breaks down, how much each party is going to be paying. It breaks down, how much you're going to be contributing towards the, the rates and taxes, the levies if it's sectional title, how the property will be maintained, that sort of thing. And like you say, you may not be able to afford the property on your own, but because you've got joint participants, it makes it a lot more affordable. But remember, all these joint participants, are responsible for the full home loan. So if one participant has to default on that home loan, that entire home loan is going to be in default. So even you, as a paying participant, can be impacted. So if you had to go and look at your credit profile on the bureau, and you find that one participant has not paid, you'll see under your profile that entire home loan will be under arrears. So you've got to be careful as well with entering into joint loans. So you need to know your partners, you need to know the affordability, and know what you're getting yourself into.
Kamini, you actually touched on something that I know a lot of people end up having issues with when they get into a joint bond. And perhaps some who are considering getting into a joint bond probably don't quite understand this particular aspect of it. In that when you do get a joint bond, is it two separate people who are paying into the bond account? Or let's say, for example, the monthly installment is 5,000 Rand. Is it taking 2.5 from each of us and getting into, the bond account at ABSA? Or is it, one person's coming out of one person's, account? I think perhaps take us through the logistics of then having that joint bond and how the flow of money essentially works.
Okay, so under a traditional home loan, there is one payment that comes out of one bank account. And this applies across all financial institutions. At ABSA, we do have a product called multi-plan. Multi-plan is unique to ABSA in that the participants can then choose how to structure the loan. And with multi-plan, you can actually have your home loan installment coming out of different bank accounts. But essentially, traditionally, it's one bank account and it's one amount that comes out of one bank account. So there will be a primary holder of that joint bond, and the installment will come out of that primary holder's bank account. So the other thing is around something you touch is around repayments. I think how you want to repay the bond is something you need to now negotiate and discuss with the participants in the joint bond. I mean, when it comes to affordability, we would look at a prorated portion to say, if there's two participants, let's assume 50 and 50, but that may not be how you are paying. One person could be paying the full 100% and the other's actually not paying anything. They're paying towards maybe the levies, or the taxes. So affordability, we do have that, we do take that into consideration, but when it comes to the actual payment that is being made to the bank, it is one payment that is being made.
And one of the things that you were mentioning earlier is around how important it is to have a conversation with the person that you're about to get into a joint bond with, because as you're saying that in the event that it defaults, it's certainly going to appear on the credit bureau. Does it appear from both parties? Because now you've just explained that it essentially, the amount would come from one person. So if I'm applying, let's say with my little brother, and we decide that, look, we're going to have the bond amount coming from my bank account as opposed to his bank account, in the event where I then default, because it's essentially, let's say there's no money in my account, would it also be affecting his credit score as well? Because I think that those are some of the things that we probably don't proactively think about, even as we're having a conversation with, whether it's our spouse or whoever we're going to be getting into a joint bond with, that it effectively doesn't just, go with splitting the bills, but in the event that one party defaults, who does it affect, whose credit score gets tarnished? Because I've certainly seen a lot of examples where, especially when, couples have decided to get a joint bond, And the moment things go sour, the one decides they're not going to pay because they know that it might negatively affect the other party's credit score. So certainly understanding who gets affected in the event where payment isn't made on the joint bond.
That's a very good question. And recall the definition at the beginning of this, at the beginning where I've said, each participant is jointly and severally liable for this mortgage loan agreement. So even if one party has to default on this loan agreement, you as a paying party will be seen as being in arrears on that loan agreement. So if I had to do an inquiry on you at the credit bureau, I will see your loan agreement being in default. So remember, if you're applying for a joint home loan, okay, it's one account number that you will see on your profile and on the secondary participant's profile. But you will see the full joint bond amount. You'll see the full installment on the bureau. So you've got to be very careful when entering into joint bond. That's why I say you need to know the you need to know the affordability of the participants. You need to do a credit check on the participants as well, especially if you're not related, or you're not close to them when it comes to the income and expenses of their household. So yes, you'll definitely appear as being in arrears on your home loan even if you are the paying party.
Understanding, the importance of having a conversation with people becomes such an important thing coming in. When we come back, I actually want us to look at things like, life cover, because I know that when we're getting property, certainly as individuals by yourself, we get life cover. When we then get into a joint bond, are we both having to get that life cover? And I think some of the intricacies that go into getting into a joint bond. If you have any questions and comments at home, do send them through. Have you ever gone into a joint bond, whether it's with a spouse or a property? We want to hear your stories. How was it? I think one of the things is a lot of people probably went into it without understanding the full extent of what it might potentially mean, that perhaps further down the line, in the event where the party who is paying, or certainly as per your agreement, doesn't pay, that it also affects you. Were you ever in such a situation? We certainly want to hear from you here on the Private Property Podcast. We're going to go for a quick break and we'll be back just after this. Welcome back to episode 85 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama Kumalo. This evening, we're looking at buying a joint property. We want to better understand what the ramifications of going into a property transaction with a spouse or a friend or a family. It certainly does have long-lasting effects, and I think a lot of us probably might not be aware about just how further down the line, this could potentially affect us. We certainly want to make sure that in the event that you're considering getting into a joint bond, you understand what it entails, what the T's and C's are before you sign on the dotted line. It's a 20 or sometimes even a 30-year-long commitment. You certainly want to make sure that you understand as much of it as possible. And to help us better understand is, of course, Wednesday, and we're speaking to ABSA Home Loans right here in the Private Property Podcast. This evening, I'm joined by Kamini Ramsamy, who is the head of acquisitions and pricing at ABSA Home Loans. Now, Kamini, I think let's look at then what happens when it comes to life cover. We know that certainly those of us who've bought, property, that becomes such an important part of the property transaction. In the event where we've now bought, a joint property, or certainly getting into a joint bond, must both of us have life cover? Or is it only one person who essentially has to have it?
Okay, so life cover is optional when it comes to the home loan. However, it is advisable, for for participants to look at taking life cover and to protect oneself against loss of income. You know, certain banks or financial institutions do offer differentiated home loan products, and those products may require you to have life cover to qualify for certain benefits. So I think one needs to always check if you are opting in for those differentiated products or propositions that does require life cover under the joint lending. But like I said, life cover for a home loan is very much optional and up to the customer.
So, you know, we've spoken quite a bit about getting into the transaction and what you need to be looking at, and certainly the conversation that you need to be having with the potential person that you're going to get into the joint bond with. Perhaps let's look at getting out. I mean, as much as we know that property is a 20, sometimes 30-year long relationship, we also know that not many relationships actually last that long, not just property relationships, but any relationship for that matter. And it may just happen that people want to exit that particular property before the 20-year loan period is essentially up. What is then the process that one gets into in the event where you've probably been, you know, have this property, let's say it's 5, 6, even 10 years, but now whether you are having it with your spouse, but you essentially want to walk your separate ways, what is the process behind essentially exiting when you have a joint property?
Yes, certainly. So a mortgage loan is definitely not for life. And if one party wants to exit the loan agreement, then the remaining party or parties will need to now, commence a substitution of debtor process, which means that there will now be a transfer of the outstanding balance of the home loan to the remaining parties on the loan agreement. You know, so this entails now a new bond application to the bank. You know, there will be registration costs because you're changing the debtors of the home loan. You know, you're also changing the bondholders on the deeds office. Also, remember there's a paid portion of the property that will now have to be shared. So essentially, you're cancelling the bond. So there's bond cancellation fees. You are re-registering the bond. So there's registration fees. There's also advance rates and taxes. You know, there's advance levies if it's sectional title. So there's a whole bunch of costs that's incurred in in cancelling the bond. And when it comes to transfer, there's also transfer fees depending on the loan amount or the bond amount at the deeds office. Also depends on the reason for the person exiting the loan agreement. So if it is a divorce, then generally the transfer fees are exempt. So like I said, it can get very complex. The negotiations around these costs can get very, very complex depending on the circumstances. Alternatively, what you could do is you could completely cancel the loan agreement, and you could sell the entire property to a third party who is different or from the original loan agreement, and you can use the transaction. You can use the funds or the proceeds from that sale to essentially settle the outstanding balance of the bank or to settle any additional costs that have been incurred from this transaction. So it is very complex. It's a very complex process to have a party to leave that joint bond. It's actually easier to just apply for a whole new application, than to have one party leave that agreement.
I actually wanted us to look at in the event where you don't go the easy route, because as you say, it certainly is easier sometimes to simply sell it and settle whatever outstanding amount there is. And in the event where there's excess amount, you as the party, or certainly both of you, can go look for other properties without getting into a joint bond. I want us to look at in the event where the one party is exiting, a joint property, and the other party wants to stay. Suppose it was a primary residence, and you still actually want to stay. You don't have any plans of wanting to move from that particular house. After the bond registrations, certainly when the bond cancellation happens, and obviously now a new bond has to be registered, is the party who's staying in the property, are they supposed to essentially do a home loan application from scratch where their affordability is assessed from the beginning? So almost as though they're essentially buying a property from the get-go, Or is there consideration around, so this home loan has been around for, let's say, 10 years, X amount of equity is in it. So in the event where it even gets, let's say, sold or registered to the new party, perhaps the amount that it's sold for could be less. I mean, I know it's a fairly complex, it's not as simple as you're saying, that it is relatively complex, but just to give viewers a better sense of what exactly does go in, because we certainly are going to see people wanting to exit for whatever reason, especially people, perhaps maybe you're a spouse and you're not breaking up, or even if it was friends or family, and now you perhaps no longer want anything to do with that particular property. Just to better understand what then happens to the party that decides to stay and essentially take the slightly more complicated route instead of going the easier route.
Yeah, so I think like I've explained, the remaining parties will have to now apply for a brand new application. So what you're doing is you're applying for an application for the outstanding balance of the original loan agreement. So we've got to go through a whole new application process. We've got to assess affordability, because there's a lot that has changed now. You may, when we assessed you at the time, there could have been 2 or 3 participants. Now there's just 1 participant. So we've got to see if you can afford that outstanding balance of the loan. So yes, it is definitely a whole new application. It is daunting to see if you can afford it or not. If you can't afford it, then the bank will have to look at selling that property and getting someone else to buy that property. So it is a bit of it's an emotional process if you don't qualify for the outstanding balance of that loan, or to continue that loan under a new agreement. It has to be a new agreement, because you've now changed the bondholders at the deeds office. So it has to be a new loan.
We are, of course, taking questions and comments from viewers at home. If you've ever had a joint property, what was your experience with it? Was it a seamless process? What did you find certainly to be useful, or perhaps not so useful with getting into a joint property? We certainly want to hear how private property viewers are finding this particular one. I think this is one of those things that I haven't gotten into a joint property. If anything, I've heard a lot of horror stories. And I think a part of me is thinking, when I do get into joint transactions, it's usually via a company. But as we're saying, this is more consumer focused. We'll certainly look at it from a different perspective altogether when we're buying commercial property. We've got a comment here from Martha Shingange, who says, my first home was on a joint bond and allowed us to get a high bond amount to buy a house we wanted. So when things went south, I was ready to buy out my partner. It could have been worse, but I'm glad it worked out. It got our foot into the property market. And we've got one here from Portia Litlape, who says joint bonds does have its benefits, I guess, if it assists with affordability for a property, but needs to be done with caution. Someone you can rely on. I mean, it's a 20-year-long relationship. And I think it's also one of those things, when I think about it, I think, look, buying a property with other people, certainly in our individual capacities for a long period, for an extended period of time, is quite daunting. I think a lot of us can attest to that. I was saying earlier that it's a long-term relationship. Not a lot of people gets to 20 years. Now imagine, getting into a legally binding agreement with somebody over a property. It certainly is one of those things that can be quite daunting. Kamini, perhaps share with us, any advice for viewers at home, advice and tips for viewers at home who are watching, who are either considering to get into, getting a home bond, about some of the things that we need to be mindful of before we walk the path, and some of the questions that we should be asking, whether asking the person we're about to get into the home loan agreement with, or certainly be asking the bank, because I think sometimes we're not as empowered when it comes to asking financial institutions various questions, because we are either intimidated or we simply just don't know what we should be asking.
Yes, I think, look, I think if you are looking at getting into a joint bond, you need to know the partner or the participant that you're getting into the joint bond with. So you need to know, like I said earlier, the affordability. So really go through the exercise, break down your income and expenses. If it's someone you've got a relationship with, do that exercise together. Really know your affordability, because this does play a part, especially now where we are in a very low interest rate environment. And we know that interest rates are going to go up in the next 18 months to 24 months. So provision for things like that, provision for interest rates going up. Like I said earlier as well, do a credit check on yourself and the other party. You want to know if there's any existing debt on the bureau or anything that you should be aware of, because you're both liable for the full loan on that loan agreement. You also may want to look at if you pre-qualify beforehand. And the good thing about the property market is it's quite seasoned. You've got some really good SMEs out there. You've got your bankers, you've got your mortgage originators, you've got the attorneys. So there's some really good people that you can ask for advice as well. If you're not married, speak to your attorneys as well. Speak to them about putting this DPA or the domestic partnership agreement together, which stipulates, how each party is going to be paying. Know those sort of things beforehand. Know your rights as well in the agreement. But yeah, a joint bond is very exciting because you can now afford a property that is slightly more expensive than you would have typically looked for on your own. So it is quite exciting. It allows you to be a homeowner of a really good property that you want. But you just need to be careful. You just need to make sure you've done your homework. You've checked out your partner. You know what you're getting into. But yeah, I think that's about it. If there's anything that anybody wants to know, like I've said earlier, there's quite a few advice out there in the market that one can contact and find out the legalities around it, and just really understand what they're getting themselves into when it comes to a joint bond.
And I think, Kamini, one of the things that certainly this conversation has made me appreciate is, in as much as it is a daunting experience, and even viewers at home are saying, and even yourself, that look, it certainly does open up the opportunity for you to own a home that you previously wouldn't afford. So never mind, trying to help somebody who can't access let's say their first apartment. This could be both of you looking for your family home, let's say in a suburban area where, as an individual, you certainly wouldn't have been able to afford it, but because you're now essentially applying as a couple, or certainly as the two of you, you now have access to that home loan facility. I think it is one of those things, as Kamini said, you want to have that very tough and very difficult conversation every time we talk about money. It can be very stressful, but you want to understand your partner's financial standing, and this is partner in the broadest sense, not just your intimate partner, but certainly the person you're going to be partnering with to get into this particular joint property. It's one of those very uncomfortable conversations that you want to have, and make sure that you're both on the same page when it comes to this one. Kamini, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Zama. Thank you.
And that is Kamini Ramsamy, who is the head of acquisitions and pricing at Absa Home Loans. As I said, one of the big things, and even Kamini has echoed this one of the things you certainly want to do before getting into a joint bond is have that difficult conversation with the person you're about to get into that facility with. Understand each other's financial standing, but also even your financial goals, because it is a long-term commitment. And you want to make sure that both of you are in it for the long run, and you're not going to be defaulting on your home loan at all. Well, folks, that's it this evening from us at the Private Property Podcast. It's been such a pleasure being with you this evening. We're back again tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Until then, as usual, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Clifton Smithers. I live in Belito, where my partners and I run a business called Union 3. As a family, we chose to move here about 6 years ago. What attracted us to the area was the safe and relaxed lifestyle of the North Coast. We're surrounded by so much natural beauty, and we love that it's so casual. It's just not as intense as a busy city. In fact, that's one of the main reasons there's so many people moving into the area. There's some amazing lifestyle estates out here. We've got Zimbali, Brettonwood Estate, and Zimbiti, to name a few. The Belito Lifestyle Centre caters to everyone's needs. There's also some smaller commercial centres like Tiffany's in Salt Rock. There's some excellent restaurants to choose from, and there's a really wide variety of activities on offer. From mountain biking out on the trails to surfing at any one of the beaches, there really is something for everyone. This quiet little town really comes alive over the weekend. The live concerts in the farmers market at the Lychee Orchard is very popular. With the new international airport just 15 minutes down the road and the unmatched lifestyle that this place offers, it's no wonder that the North Coast is the fastest growing town in South Africa. My family and I absolutely love it here, and this is our neighborhood.
Tips for dealing with the bank. So perhaps you're renting in a property where it is run by a body corporate.
Understanding the basic calculation, income minus expenses, and you want to be left with a positive income.
It is a very tough game. It's not easy at all.
To stay ahead of knowing exactly what your clients need, what their teething issues are.
Have a joint move-in inspection.
That a lot of people that are coming into sectional title homeowners associations are, just like you described, not only first-time homeowners, but first-time owners and residents in community schemes.
They get to see the perspective from the other side of the aisle. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
It's a market that's estimated to be transacting at least 9 billion rand per year. So it's a huge market.
In order to get there, you need to be able to build up a track record.
Your cash flow model needs to be sharp.
A quote comes to mind. The best time to buy a property was about 10 years ago. The next best time is now.